In the real world, the one that we live in, strong countries dominate weak countries, and that trend shows no sign of changing. The very least you can say about the English is that they took their colonial responsibilities seriously. They didn't just take things, they added. When the US government withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years, we left behind airstrips, shipping containers, and guns. When the British pulled out of India, they left behind an entire civilization, a language, a legal system, schools, churches, and public buildings, all of which are still in use today. Here's the train station the English built in Bombay, for example. There's nothing like that in Washington, D.C. right now, much less in Kabul or Baghdad. Today, India is far more powerful than the UK, the nation that once ruled it, and yet after 75 years of independence, has that country produced a single building as beautiful as the Bombay train station that the British colonialists built? No, sadly, it has not.
That was, of course, Fox News star anchor Tucker Carlson talking about the end of British colonial rule in India. Our next guest, Katie Halper, co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast and host of the Katie Halper Show, joins us now to react, and I suspect you see matters differently, Katie. Welcome.
I do. Thank you. Well, I appreciate Tucker Carlson's criticism of the U.S. Actions in Afghanistan. I say that sincerely. He, by the way, in that clip, he goes on to say how there was no genocide, that England committed no genocide, and that they were very benign, and that no empire was as benign as the British. But I just wanted to start out by saying I think it's so weird that he singles out this one train station. Like, who can forget the soaring balustrades of that Bombay train station of 1878? As if that's something that he's supposed to be a populist. Like, does he really think that's going to be something that most people watching relate to? Also, I tweeted out, Tucker is right. India never built a butt plug as beautiful as London's 30 St. Mary Axe. Taj Mahal doesn't hold a candle.
This is a family show, Katie.
This is a family show. To be fair, it could also be seen as a pickle. That's what its nickname is. But and by the way, that train station did, of course, combine Indian architecture style with British. So even his claim that it's some kind of British contribution is false. But just the historic record is very clear that Indian exports fell from 27% of world exports to 2%. India was referred to as the golden bird before the British looters basically drained it of its wealth. And at the beginning of the 18th century, India's share of the world economy was 23%, which was as large as all of Europe's put together. And then after the British left, it was less than 4%. Also, literacy rates were down to 13% when the British left. And India has managed to raise that literacy rate to 75% today. So that's a monument in itself, I would say. And there's what's really interesting.
What was the literacy rate before the British came in? I get right. That would be the fair comparison.
I don't know what it is.
Probably hard to even know. We're talking about early 1800s at that point.
Right. But I know the life expectancy. Yeah.
It's an interesting flex, though, because of all the countries to pick, it's hard to find one that has an older history than India, that's contributed more to math and the sciences, our historical understanding of the world, spices, technology in terms of agriculture, clothes manufacture, the entirety of human history springs out of a nearby region, and obviously India is like the beneficiary of so much of the trade that went through Central Asia for most of human history. Tucker Carlson is kind of bragging about the English imposing English as a language when over 1,000 languages existed in India. The Indian Constitution references 22 languages to this day. There really is like kind of the soft bigotry of low expectations for England here. And it's a weird fight to pick with a country that, I think few of us misunderstand as being anything other than extremely influential and extremely accomplished. Even if we were going to play this game of, who's, relative cultural value on planet Earth, which is not a game I think we should be playing at all.
Right. And I'm pretty sure that it did actually drop, Robbie, the literacy rate, speaking to your point earlier. But yeah, Bree, I agree. This is a weird hill to die on. And singling out a single train station in the country that has like the Lotus Temple or the Taj Mahal or these architectural gems is just very weird. But
it's
also,
the seventh wonder of the world.
Yeah. I also thought it was interesting that if Tucker Carlson, he may not take what you and I say very seriously, or maybe people from India or in India very seriously, but I thought he'd be interested to know what some British people said at the time of the colony, of colonialism, excuse me. So there's a really great book that I recommend. It's called An Era of Darkness, The British Empire in India by Shashi Tharoor. And he includes a lot of primary sources from British people, including, for example, Sir John Sullivan, who was a British official. He was a colonial administrator and founder of the British settlement of Ouda Command. And he said, in the 1840s, he wrote, "The little court disappears, the capital decays, trade languishes, the capital decays. The people are impoverished, the Englishman flourishes and acts like a sponge, drawing up riches from the banks of the Ganges and squeezing them down upon the banks of the Thames." So he was very clear of how exploitative that relationship was. Another person, another colonial official, Lord William Bentnick, said, "In many respects, the Mohammedans surpassed our rule. They settled in countries they conquered. The interests and sympathies of the conquerors and conquered became identified. Our policy, on the contrary, has become the reverse of this, cold, selfish, and unfeeling. The iron hand of power on the one side, monopoly and exclusion on the other." And of course, the British did destroy the Indian textile industry through many policies. It was official policy to do so.
I would dispute, though. I don't think colonialism was not very good for the colonizers either, in a lot of respects, or at least for the colonies in the Americas that Britain and Spain and France had and so forth. They were so unruly, they had to constantly keep trying to subdue them. It was under a mercantilist theory of, trying to keep wealth within the nation, or having different places that were still the nation to move the wealth, that was discredited, again, by the time this was coming into being.
Can I reframe this real quick, just for a second? If we were talking about any Western country, whether or not a colonial and an invasion, which is the word we're using right now because of Russia and Ukraine. In any other context, an invasion would not be judged on whether or not it inured to the benefit of the people and what degree. We would have a fundamental respect for the autonomy of the people who got invaded. But for some reason, we're talking about colonial subjects, largely brown people around the world. There's a very different level of conversation that's being had. And should I remind everybody here that this country was also one of those colonial subjects, and we're not sitting here dithering about whether or not America had a right to be
But I don't think anyone
free.
in this conversation, including Tucker Carlson, is saying that colonialism was good. Like, his whole point of that thing was that this is akin to what we did in Afghanistan, et cetera.
No,
and it was bad.
It's not akin. I think it's not akin to what we did in Afghanistan, is his argument. He's saying that there's a big contrast between what we did in Afghanistan and what the British did. I don't think he's saying colonialism is inherently problematic at all. Now, you can argue, Robbie, I think, that colonialism wasn't good for most people, even in the colonizing countries. And that's a theme that we see through history, right? When we talk about countries being enriched, it's the top 1% of the country that's enriched. It's not the masses who are enriched by these policies, even though they, of course, support them. And that's, there's divide and conquer. And that's how white supremacy and racism works. And, the American dream, or whatever you want to talk about.
Right.
But I also think it's interesting that he does mention that there weren't any genocides. He talks about how benign they were as an empire. And, there was the Bengal famine, which was caused through policies implemented by Winston Churchill, who, by the way, Winston Churchill said, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. Let the viceroy sit on the back of a giant elephant and trample Gandhi into the dirt." There was also a famous massacre in Amritsar in 1919 when thousands of people were gathering in a public garden. Some of them were protesting and some of them were just celebrating a Sikh holiday. And without warning, the British closed off the exits, attacked them, and actually fired all their ammunition. So they didn't stop shooting until they ran out of all their ammunition, which was about 10 minutes later. And this killed up to 1,000 people. That's something that Prime Minister David Cameron, and then Prime Minister in 2013, David Cameron, acknowledged but refused to apologize for. He said, "I don't think the right thing is to reach back into history and to seek out things that we should apologize for. I think the right thing to do is to acknowledge what happened, to recall what happened, to show respect and understanding for what happened." Also, they used to practice something, since Tucker Carlson thinks they're such a benign, enlightened empire who brought so many important things to India. They also used to practice something called blowing from a gun, which is when they would tie a person to a cannon and fire the cannon. And they did this especially during the rebellion of 1857. It was then called the Mutiny of 1857. And that's obviously an extremely violent way to kill someone. You're blowing them up into pieces. And it also was especially useful because it meant that Muslim and Hindu burial rites couldn't be, funeral rites couldn't be practiced because of the bodies being torn apart. And just want to raise people's awareness, to draw people's attention to Kenya, where the British were forced to pay insignificant, but still they were forced to pay some reparations because they, during the Mau Mau rebellion, they killed, maimed, or tortured 90,000 Kenyans and detained 160,000 in concentration camps. And the British Foreign Secretary did say, "I would like to make clear now and for the first time on behalf of Her Majesty's government that we understand the pain and grievance felt by those who were involved in the events of the emergency in Kenya. The British government recognizes that Kenyans were subject to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration. The British government sincerely regrets that those abuses took place and that they marred Kenya's progress towards independence." So Tucker Carlson should talk to the Foreign Minister of England.
I would say that the British Empire, like every other empire, every other state in every other part of the world for all of human history, yes, committed obscene and extreme atrocities, which were just a way of life, unfortunately, for all people who lived like before the last 100 years.
All empires, all colonists who lived before. Some of us weren't colonists, and even people who were in colonial powers at the time, many of them objected to the
colonial powers are not the only ones who committed atrocities, though.
Right, but we're talking about colonialism because there are many people who are confused about why not everyone was super sad about Queen Elizabeth dying, and this is the reason why.
And it was also official policy of immiserating countries. I mean, that was something that I just read one quote, but there's several quotes from British people at the time who weren't even like activists. They were colonial officials, and they noted how exploitative this was. Again, this was a policy to ruin their economy. It really was. I mean, they replaced the Indian textile company. They wouldn't industry. They wouldn't they forced India to export the resources. Then it was made in England and sent back to India. They would even break people's looms. I mean, it wasn't subtle or anything. They applied laws that made it illegal for India to maintain their textile industry. And this really was, they just plundered this nation. I mean, you can say that you can have a nuanced conversation about colonialism and imperialism, but you can't deny that the basic foundation of it is basically looting a country. That was the point.
Well, thank you as always for some historical perspective, Katie.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.